it is. Hey, it is Wednesday, June 11th, 2025. Today's our special guest is Commissioner Jake Taylor from Bel Air and candidate for the Maryland House of Delegates. Our special hostess tonight is Liliana Arcadis, and our host is Mark Unkelberg. Take it away, guys.
Well, welcome to both of you, and thank you Dwight, for that warm handoff. Always enthusiastic. He has obviously had caffeine right before he does that introduction. Jake, in the last couple weeks, you announced that you were a candidate for the House of Delegates, and tell us a little bit about that announcement and how it was received.
Absolutely. So I announced on May 29th that I would be seeking to represent my community, Bel Air and Abingdon, District 34B in the Maryland House of Delegates. On June 3rd, I filed for that office. I came to that conclusion seeing what progress we were able to make locally in Bel Air. Dwight mentioned at the top just a moment ago that I'm a local elected official, and that's an oath that I take very seriously. But what I've noticed over the past 2 years serving in that office is that all the good that we can do for Bel Air, and we've done a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about that soon, it is cutting against the grain of what's coming down from Annapolis. Annapolis is imposing mandates on units of local government. They're making it harder for communities like ours to police themselves effectively so that we stay the safe small town that we are. They're making it harder for us to write our own laws, and they're certainly making it harder for us to balance our budget with their fiscal irresponsibility. And so I ultimately came to the conclusion that if I have a duty to serve my community, and I feel like I do, that it would be a dereliction of that duty not to take the fight to where the problems are originating, or at least in large part being sent out to communities like Bel Air across the state of Maryland, and that's in Annapolis. So I made the decision to represent or seek to represent my community in Annapolis. So far, the reception has been wonderful. Plenty of neighbors, friends across the community have reached out with their support. And I'm really looking forward to the next year of campaigning where we're going to talk to just about everybody in the district over the year. That's why I thought it was important to get out early, was to just start talking to people as soon as I could, because I suspect I know what they're going to say. I know they're going to say Annapolis is making their life harder, but I want to know how I can help them if they should send me to Annapolis as their representative. So I'm really looking forward to embarking on that process over the next year.
So you mentioned that as did Dwight, that you're a commissioner in Bel Air and that you've given an experience. Could you kind of elaborate on how did you end up as a commissioner, and what have you learned as a commissioner?
That's a great question. Well, simple answer is I ended up as a commissioner because my neighbors saw fit to send me to town hall. But the long answer to that, and the reason I put that first and foremost, is because I never take for granted the fact that I only hold the office I hold because my neighbors, the voters, put that trust in me, and that's first. But the longer answer to that is that we had a rather unique campaign, I'd say, 2 years ago in the town of Bel Air. Municipal elections are often sleepy, low turnout affairs. Sometimes many municipalities across the state either have uncontested elections, or some, and I'm not convinced as the constitutionality of this, but some I've seen actually cancel their elections if nobody runs. That happens on the Eastern Shore. So in Bel Air, though, in 2023, we had a really unique situation where there were plenty of citizens who were deeply concerned about the future of the town, the direction that the town was headed. And this most readily manifested itself in the mode of development, particularly the rezoning of a particular property along a residential street to a more commercial zoning that would have allowed for high density multifamily housing. Now, for me, this underlying issue wasn't even the biggest motivating factor. It was certainly up there. But the reason, what I say, the thing that got me off the couch was the way that the current, back then, the previous majority of the board handled a petition for referendum to overturn that rezoning. And instead of providing the citizens, several thousand citizens, by the way, it was the largest number of names, the largest number of signatures that had ever been presented to the board for a petition for referendum for an ordinance that they had passed of any kind. Instead of treating those citizens with the respect and the collegiality that I felt they deserved, They essentially, I would say, led them on a wild goose chase that prevented those citizens from being able to check all the boxes in fulfilling the legal sufficiency of that petition. So in the end, the petition was thrown out and the board got their way. But the people, of course, as they always do, had their opportunity to make their displeasure at that decision heard, and they did so at the ballot box. And so running on that platform, I'd say that was my catalyst issue, but it certainly wasn't my only issue. I've always been concerned about public safety in the town of Bel Air, which is why I've been proud for the past 2 budget cycles to always vote to fully fund the Bel Air Police Department. I've been concerned about the business climate in the town of Bel Air, particularly the small, unique businesses that make our main streets so strong and vibrant and make our commercial district so productive. And ensuring that taxes remain low in the town of Bel Air. We have never voted to raise taxes. And I'm also just concerned about fiscal responsibility. We have balanced our budget, and we've balanced our budget, with, as I said, without raising taxes, but we've also managed through shrewd fiscal management to make serious, really historic investments in not just things like public safety, but infrastructure, including replacing wastewater sewage pumps that are 50, 60 years old. And the joke that often gets made up my way, and I think it's applicable around the state, is if the board of town commissioners went missing, for 2 months, no one would notice. No one would notice that the politicians are gone. But if our Department of Public Works took off work for 2 months, people would notice the sewage floating through their front yard, and they would care. So those are the real material things that we're focused on in Bel Air. And we're really proud to work on those things. Those are the things that I ran on, and it's really a great experience to be able to do what I said I was going to do as I was knocking on my neighbors' doors.
It sounds like one of the impetus for your first running was a development issue. What's your approach towards development? And obviously, there's some balances to be struck between preservation and affordable housing. How do you square that circle?
Absolutely. There has to be a balance. I believe in preserving communities, and I believe in preserving the character of communities specifically, which can be difficult because that's an untangible thing. That's an intangible. It's not a quantitative metric, it's a qualitative metric. At the same time, you of course we respect property rights. This is America after all, and we respect enterprise. So you've got to protect the property rights of owners while also protecting the folks who may have bought into that neighborhood on the reliance that their community would have a certain character, a certain small town charm. So you've got to respect the property rights of the whole community. Now, having given you that vignette about my philosophy, let's dive into some details. So there are 2 pieces of legislation that I'd point to that give a good idea of my philosophy, which is really just as a canard as this is, it's common sense. So the first thing, my first piece of legislation that I passed when I got on the board was a reform to how the town of Bel Air approached open space. And what I mean by that is open space or green space is the open or amenity space that particularly a multifamily high density housing development, developer would have to provide as part of the project. There's got to be a certain square footage of the project that is either open, amenity, or green. Well, previously, the law said that the developer could pay a lump sum and buy themselves out of that requirement. I didn't think that was right. And so we passed a law that severely restricted their ability to do that. We abolished that altogether in certain zones or certain residential zones where we felt it made no sense at all. And we brought that down to a threshold of at the most 35% in the most intense industrial districts. And the reason why we retained, again, a little bit of it is because balance. We recognize that in certain commercial industrial districts where they're already paved asphalt and gravel, there's not a lot of green space to be had. You certainly don't want high density cubes because that doesn't look good anywhere, but you also can't expect a pocket park on top of a parking lot. So we passed that piece of legislation. And that was one of the first things we did when the new majority took over. And I'm very proud to have been the key sponsor there. The next piece of legislation that we did rather recently was there were 2 zones in town that did not have a cap on residential density. That is, you could, everywhere else in town, you really can't build any denser than 20 units an acre. In two particular zones, these are the B2A and B3A zones. Not that the audience is particularly well versed in the town of Bel Air zoning code, but just, these are considered moderate intensity commercial zones. These are the step down zones from our downtown area. One that goes out towards Churchville, if folks know where that is, and one that goes towards our more heavy commercial district on the western edge of town. And it was decided some time ago, I believe 10, 15 years ago, that parking requirements would regulate density in those two zones. Well, to make a long story short, there was a project that got approved that basically found a loophole that if they could get their parking requirement approved in an unorthodox fashion, whereby they could avail themselves of spots in a parking garage, they no longer had the same restriction on their density. And so what is currently the densest project in Bel Air, which is at about 23 units an acre, there's a little bump above that 20 because it's a 55 and up development, and those particular developments don't have to yield to, they don't produce as many kids, right? Because it's 55 and up. So they get a little bit of a grace because they don't affect the schools. This particular project was at nearly 60 units an acre. So we passed a piece of legislation that in the B2A and B3A zones, we put them back in line with what the rest of the town was at, which was at an absolute ceiling, with a few exceptions, of 20 units an acre, because it just made absolutely no sense. It was totally inconsistent with the town of Bel Air to be at 60 units an acre. So I'm all for growth that is consistent with the character of the town. I'm all for growth that has a clear and positive benefit to the town, as many of the small businesses who move in do. We're really glad to see new small businesses popping up left and right in town. But we've got to be mindful of what Bel Air is about. We can't pave over paradise and put up a parking lot, to paraphrase an old song. And so I think Bel Air has something special. It's worth protecting, and it's worth doing that in an even-handed way. And I think that's what we've done.
Yeah. Let me step back. Go ahead, Lilia.
I was going to say, jumping back in time a little bit, what really compelled you to become active in the realm of politics?
That's a good question, because I sort of gave you I put the cart before the horse. I told you why I've run for town commissioner, but I've been active in politics for several years before that, of course. And really, the answer goes, it's kind of a long story. I'll give you the abridged version. The answer kind of goes back to like elementary school. I have known since I was a kid, and I do thank God for having this level of certainty. I do think it's a blessing to me, because I know there are a lot of people who have no idea what they want to do with their lives. I have always known that the American experiment, our brilliant foundational principles and foundational document, the Constitution, and the brilliant men who put those systems together, their legacies are worth defending. And I've just sort of intuitively felt that since fifth grade, believe it or not. It's just, for me, there has been no greater amazement in my life than when I first thought about the revolution and thought about these men who were willing to sacrifice their lives, their liberties, their fortunes, their honor, right, in betraying the crown so that they could be loyal to liberty. That to me is just such a compelling chapter of American history. Actually, it's a compelling chapter of human history, because it really is something unique. It's a unique moment in human history. So that's the 10,000 foot view, is that for me, my calling has always been public service, because I think these things are worth defending. I think our country is worth defending and worth serving. And it's worth noting that, I did grow up in a Christian household where service was put first. And so to me, this is a natural melding of those two things. Now, as to how I got involved in the more practical, the practice of politics, you could say, that is Ronald Reagan's fault. That was, listening to the speeches of Ronald Reagan, reading his autobiography, An American Life, which I highly recommend for anyone who hasn't read it. It is thick. It's 800 pages, but it's 800 pages well worth it. That's when I went from, okay, I care about America, and I know that I care about our system of government, to, well, I also care about free markets. I care about a strong national defense. I care about equal protection under the law. I care about individual rights. Those are the things that made me realize I was a Republican. And so I got involved with local campaigns, starting really in high school. and I ran for the Republican Central Committee in 2022. I managed a state Senate campaign in 2022 that wound up being the closest state Senate campaign in Maryland. At that time, we came up about 500 votes short. I learned a lot from that loss. It was a tough loss to take, but I learned a lot from it. And it wasn't 6 months later that I was filing for the board. So it's been a quick process, but it has been something that it's been a blessing and it's been a gift. And I don't take a day of it for granted because, again, to go back to what I said earlier, I recognize that I'm only here because my neighbors put their trust in me to put me here. And that's a very special thing. It's a very sacred calling. And it's a privilege.
So Annapolis is a target-rich environment in terms of things that you could do. It's kind of a challenge. Let me phrase my question this way. What would be your first bill that you would want to introduce? What would be your priority as a legislator?
There are so many things that Annapolis gets wrong and that need fixing. And so it's difficult to pin that down. And I did another show on Monday, and I'll give you the same two answers that I gave them, because the caveat that I got on Monday, because it was more of a nonpartisan show, and this sort of caters to us Republicans, but was give me something that you feel like could actually get passed, right? Don't just throw red meat to the base. So I'll give you one where I really think this just is something that Annapolis needs to do, and whether or not the Democratic majority wants to pass it or not, they need to be held accountable. They need to have their feet held to the fire, and we need to have the conversation. And then I'll give you one that I feel like we could find some common ground with the majority and make the state better. So the first thing that I want to talk about is there was a bill that was put in last session called the Right to Teach Act. And that essentially said, this is a common sense reform that would have said, if you've got a student that has significant disciplinary issues to the point where the teacher is now spending more time controlling this student than actually teaching the class, so that this student is not just making it harder for the teacher to teach, but they're making it harder, impossible really, for their classmates to learn, that teacher is empowered to separate that student from the classroom, send them to the principal's office, and that student cannot be returned to the classroom unless the teacher, a school counselor, the principal, a school counselor, and that teacher all agree that it is the only possible placement for that student to return him to the classroom. That's not a silver bullet to fix our educational issues, but we know, and quite frankly, I think we don't talk about it enough. We talk a lot about funding, and Lord knows we talk a lot about education funding, but we don't talk about actual classroom environments. And when I talk to a lot of teachers, especially around this area, they're telling me that classroom discipline is one of the things that is making their job so much more difficult than it was 10, 20 years ago. So that's something that I just think Annapolis needs to be held accountable on. And we need to have that conversation, because we're not right now for a number of politically driven reasons. There are other things like unchaining the gas tax from CPI, which is one of the most ridiculous ideas that Annapolis ever thought of, because the gas tax is already one of the most regressive taxes in the state. Just in general, the gas tax is a regressive tax. It hits poor people a lot harder than it hits affluent people. It hits the middle class and the working class a lot harder than it hits the upper class. And so the idea that when people are already stretching dollar to dollar because inflation is high, that's when you're going to hit them with a gas tax increase, that is utter nonsense. That's something that many of my fellow Republicans have gone after. It's something that I wholeheartedly believe in. It's something I'll go after. In terms of something that we may be able to find common ground, and this may be optimistic, but I'll throw it out there because I think it's important. We have an energy crisis in the state, and we have an energy crisis that's been manufactured by irresponsible mandates that have been passed by Annapolis. Irresponsible energy policies that mandate that we need to hit certain benchmarks for power produced, not just renewably, because if it was just renewably, we wouldn't be having this conversation, but particularly certain thresholds for wind and solar, which we know just don't hold up in terms of their production capacity, their output. And that's why we only produce domestically in the state of Maryland 60% of the power that we consume. And it's why your power bills went careening and ballooning upwards earlier this year, and did so again last week, June 1st. We got another increase. And Annapolis is attempting to put a Band-Aid over that bullet hole. They're so dogmatically married to wind and solar that they don't want to confront the fact that the reality is, if we keep heading towards this cliff, there will be rolling blackouts and brownouts in this state, just as the Baltimore Sun reported about a week or two ago. The only way that we can both satisfy those energy goals. And by the way, for me, conservatism also means conserving the environment. I mean, we got to put people first. We got to put communities first. But if we can take care of our air and our water, I'm all for it. But the only way we can meet those goals while also, and this is the most important thing, not leave vulnerable people without heating in the winter and cooling in the summer, which is the trajectory onto which we are headed, is to make nuclear power a significant part of those renewable energy portfolios. And so for me, that means fast tracking the construction of a second PWR, a pressurized water reactor, much like Calvert Cliffs in Calvert, Maryland, somewhere in the state of Maryland. You know, it's great that the General Assembly is taking baby steps towards permitting modular reactors, and I know that's happening in Montgomery County. That's great. That's not going to cut it. We need a second PWR. We need to duplicate Calvert Cliffs, essentially, because only that way will we both meet the statutory requirement and avoid the blackouts. The problem is, the caveat is, so the bill, to answer your question, would be to display and to feature more prominently nuclear power in our renewable portfolio, because the reality is it's just not treated the way it needs to be. The problem is, even if we do that, it'll take us 10, 15 years to get it online. And so the pill that Annapolis Democrats are going to have to swallow is that while we're getting that online, we need to treat natural gas as the clean alternative to coal that it is. And we can't treat natural gas like an enemy. We have to treat it as an efficient, cost-effective bridge to a nuclear future where we can have all our goals met of both. Basically, in the future, we can have it both ways. We can have clean, cost-effective, and abundant power in the state of Maryland that brings your bills down. But we need to start the work now, and we can't be precious about the bridge that we're going to have to cross to get there, or else there are going to be a lot of people who are really cold this winter, and there are going to be a lot of people who can't afford their electric bills, and there are going to be a lot of people who are hurting. Annapolis has set us on that course towards people hurting, and Annapolis can take us off, but we need to act fast.
That's what we were talking before about open space, and obviously your district is larger than just Bel Air, and you have a number of areas that have been set aside. And one of the consequences of the energy legislation that was recently signed into law, that was passed and signed into law, is I think it's the Certainty Act, which allows for or requires local jurisdictions to allow for siting of a certain percentage of land for solar panels. How does it affect Harford County, and what are your thoughts about that?
That's a great question. That affects Harford County a great deal. That affects Harford County to the tune of several thousand acres. As you pointed out, that piece of legislation greenlights total state preemptive authority, regardless of local zoning. And I'm very passionate about local control as a municipal official, believe me. But that preempts on 5% of priority areas any local control and allows the state to dump solar panels, which we've already discussed, don't have significant capacity issues in meeting generation goals, onto productive farmland. And simply put, you can't eat a solar panel. I wouldn't recommend it. It would hurt, and you'd get some pretty nasty chemicals in you.
I think there's lead and cadmium and a whole bunch of other things. Yes.
And so, my district is a relatively more suburban district. We're anchored in the small town of Bel Air, and we moved to it. For those who know Harford County geography, we moved towards 95 and Abingdon, which is more suburban. But Harford County at large is still a very rural community. And I'd be remiss not to mention that there are still some beautiful rural stretches of the district I hope to represent, most notably around Brooms Bloom Ice Cream, just west of 543, which is just by the hair of its chin in District 34B. Come on out if you haven't before. It's great ice cream. And that is surrounded by beautiful, verdant pastures. Of course it is. It's a creamery. That's the type of land that the state of Maryland wants to cover in solar panels. That's the type of land that the state of Maryland wants to inject lead and cadmium into the soil. That's the type of land that the state of Maryland doesn't think that Harford County government should have the authority to preserve for its intended agricultural purpose. That's what the legislation does. That's what we're talking about. And so, yes, just as a local elected official, I stood up for a sensible and really common sense approach to preserving our open space, because once you asphalt over something, it's really hard to get it back. I would do that as a delegate. and particularly as it relates to saving our farmland and preserving our farmland. There's a reason they're called PPAs in Harford County. There's a reason why they are priority preservation areas, because it's a priority to preserve them. We ought to do that, and we ought to not put energy generating technology that we know doesn't work, or at least doesn't work in the way that it should, onto productive farmland, because all I can say is you can't eat a solar panel.
Now, we've seen that some of the energy mandates that had been introduced, I guess, when Moore first became governor, reflecting legislation that had given regulatory authority to the governor to adopt essentially California style mandate. It was a step-by-step process beginning during the prior administration, but it was really Moore who implemented that. He's taken a step back from that because it really, I guess, the objectives are not obtainable. Do you see more of sort of backsliding taking place as a result of the challenges associated with this energy legislation that they've adopted? And would you encourage more of that to take place?
Well, I would absolutely encourage more of that to take place, and we can only hope that it will. Listen, I think that there are two really difficult forces for the majority in Annapolis to ignore right now, and those are the real material cost of their policies on their constituents, because the reality is that the energy bill hikes, Harford County is a relatively conservative Republican voting county, but it affected everyone in Maryland, no matter how you vote. Those hikes did not discriminate based on your partisan registration. And I think a lot of members of the majority party are feeling that now from their constituent. They're feeling that heat from their constituents. And I think that's going to be difficult for them to ignore. But I also think it's going to be difficult for them to ignore the monstrous price tags on some of these things that they'd like to enact. And at a time when the state of Maryland burned through a $5 billion surplus to get us to a $3 billion deficit, the majority party raised taxes and fees by $1.8 billion and then did a shell game to act like they cut expenditures by $1.2 billion, but really only pushed those costs back onto the local government, which is another thing we can talk about. We don't have all the time in the world, but if we did, we'd talk about that too. And the reality is that when this fiscal year 2026 budget goes into effect at the beginning of this fiscal year, it will be balanced for 1 second. And then immediately it will go back into in a state of non-balance. And that's why the General Assembly is going to be forced to call a special session sometime this fall, because they can't allow that deficit spending. Constitutionally, they can't allow that deficit spending to go on much longer. So I think, to answer your question about backpedaling, they recognize they don't have the money to put where their mouth is, because they have been writing checks with their mouth that their pocketbook cannot possibly hope to cash. And regardless of the ideological commitment that they have to these things, the numbers don't lie. And you can only play so many shell games. You can only push the counties to a certain point before you either A, do run on the verge of bankruptcy, which is sort of the warning sign that we got from Moody's when we got our credit rating downgraded. You either push the state to the edge of bankruptcy, or you realize that you've got to wake up from this hangover, that you can't keep applying hair of the dog. You've got to put the bottle down, and you've got to come down. And that's what Annapolis is going to have to do. And I suspect that this election is going to go a long way in helping them do it, because I suspect that this election is going to be a great opportunity for Republicans to really make that case to Marylanders that the so-called permanent majority has done a really poor job, and they don't deserve that majority status.
So I guess, when the General Assembly is called back into a special session in the fall, do you foresee that we might actually see some spending cuts, or do you believe that, again, this is total insight here, but do you think that we'll really see some of those spending cuts, or just more taxes to try to close the deficit?
Well, if we look at the General Assembly's track record, I'm not optimistic. Because again, to cut down to the bone of it, the reason why we have this deficit is because of the Kerwin Plan for Education. That's the reason. And as much as, Democratic leadership in Annapolis will tell you until they're blue in the face that Kerwin is fully funded until 2027, they are leaving off the really big, bold asterisk that is it's only fully funded until 2027 because they raided the general fund, money that was obligated elsewhere, to go fund Kerwin. And so now they have a deficit because they're trying to backfill all the money that they raided from the general fund. And so what they did, of course, is they raised $1.8 billion in taxes and fees. We all know that. But they also didn't really substantively cut much. They pushed those costs back onto the counties. So what I've seen and what I've heard is that it sounds like, we're probably going to see some cuts to Medicaid simply because the federal government is paring down Medicaid. And they're just not going to be able to afford to backfill in the revenue that the federal government is paring down. So that those cuts will probably come in the form of pass-through cuts. But really, what do I think is going to happen? My big fear is that they're going to put a penny on the sales tax. In the same way that, they expanded the sales tax to IT services and did it at 3% and treated that like, oh, well, we're expanding it, but we're having it because it's 3 instead of 6%. Like that helps anybody when IT and cyber is the language of business in the 21st century. So every single business, which means every single consumer, is going to feel that tax hike, which was the largest tax hike, by the way, in nominal dollars in Maryland history. The sales tax is going to have to go up if they're going to plug this hole again before 2026. And if they don't, of course, do the right thing and cut spending, which I fear they won't. And just as we were talking about the gas tax being the most regressive form of taxes, wouldn't you know it? Right there with the gas tax, the sales tax. Because who is buying retail products and for whom is that 6%, which, on a $200 purchase could be $12. Who does that extra $12 at Target really hurt, or at Walmart really hurt? It's the people who budgeted for the 200 but can't quite make it to the 12. So Annapolis has some really whacked out priorities. There's no other way to put it than they've got some whacked out priorities. And so to answer your question, again, this is purely armchair, and I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. I'm concerned that we're headed for another large tax increase. And unless they change the tune about their addiction to spending, I just don't see any other way that they can leave that special session without balancing with a balanced budget.
So we sort of backed into talking about Kerwin, the blueprint, the educational spending that is the sort of, as you've described, the sort of cause of that problem. Could you elaborate on that? We've talked about the financial requirements and the stress that it's had, and I think we've referenced the fact that it isn't just the state; it's also the counties that are feeling that. What are your thoughts about possible changes to the blueprint, to Kerwin? Not just funding, but are there other issues that ought to be addressed as well?
No doubt about it. Funding, of course, is the biggest issue because that's what's driving our fiscal cliff here in the state, but there are other things as well. The fact that this majority has not made a tweak, not just a major reform, but has not made a tweak to Kerwin, is really an indictment of their ability to live in reality. That's what it is. They have dogmatic principles. They have doctrines which they follow nearly religiously, and they are unable to meet with reality. And so when you have, let me put it this way. When you have just about every single school district in the state, regardless of how liberal the underlying jurisdiction is, from ruby red Carroll County to cobalt blue Prince George's, you have school administrators begging the General Assembly for foundational structural changes to this program, which is putting the screws to everyone and is driving our school systems to the brink of insolvency, and they won't do it. That tells me that there's a deeper underlying problem. I think we know this, but it really is being revealed right now. And so for me, my perspective is that Kerwin, if I had my way, Kerwin would go the way of Thornton. Another, insolvent, insufficient, totally misguided, failed attempt to fix our education system by throwing money at it. Kerwin is essentially just a resurrection of Thornton. Now, we were lucky enough 20 years ago that Thornton largely went the way of the dodo bird because that was the right thing to do. I'm concerned that the General Assembly of 2025 is a little bit more ideologically tenacious, I guess we'll use that word, that they have the tenacity and maybe the audacity to think that just because they believe it, they can will it into existence. So we need to really take a battle axe to Kerwin. We need to seriously recognize the problems that it's causing for kids in the classroom, because all of the spending mandates that they're putting on counties is resulting in cuts to services that are student facing, and kids are feeling the brunt of this. It's not just the state, it's not just the county government, it's not just the bottom line of government, it's not just the taxpayer. And believe me, all those things are important. I took an oath to defend the taxpayer, but also as a public servant, I take an oath to the Constitution, and the Constitution of Maryland says we need to provide education to our kids. And Kerwin, contrary to what its defenders would tell you, is actually making educational experiences for children in the classroom far worse. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is the instructional time, ratio is the word I'm looking for, where instead of spending 80% of the time in the classroom, the teacher's going to spend 60% of the time in the classroom so they can spend 40% planning instead of 20%. That sounds all fine and good. That sounds great until you realize that we're going to have to find and then hire dozens of thousands of new teachers that we cannot possibly find and hire. And so what are we going to have if we move forward with this implementation of this instructional time ratio? We're going to have classrooms that by statute cannot be covered. We will not have enough teachers to teach the children that we have. That's got to be our first priority. The quality of education that our children are getting has got to be the first priority. And it's not. Under Kerwin, and it's not for the General Assembly, at least not now. And they've got to make some serious changes if they want to signal that the kids are their first priority when it comes to education reform.
Yeah,
Are there other ways? Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's still crazy that even with, a $40 billion program, there's still unfunded mandates that are, being pushed onto the counties. You'd think with $40 billion, everything would be funded, but apparently not. I did want to shift gears a little bit because I know we had talked about the gas tax. July 1st, we'll see an increase in emissions fees, a tire tax, more just again general taxes on vehicle, a 6.5, the excise tax on vehicles will increase to 6.5%. So just generally a very large crusade against car owners. Where do you foresee transportation policy going in the future, and is there a path to kind of returning some of those, again, individual liberties? If I want to drive my car somewhere, I should be able to drive it somewhere with, without all these fees. Where do you kind of foresee some of that policy going in the future?
There is no doubt that there's a war on motorists in the state of Maryland. There can be no doubt about this. There is no doubt that the General Assembly wants to drive as many motorists, no pun intended, off the road as possible and force us into a mass transit system that we know doesn't work and that we don't have the infrastructure to support, because Maryland is a suburban state and has been built around an interstate highway and U.S. highway system before that since at least the Eisenhower administration, if not the Coolidge administration, when the U.S. highways were constructed and when Route 40 and the like were constructed. And so they are putting every financial barrier possible on being able to afford a car. They're putting every barrier on that possible. And they're going to funnel it. They're going to funnel it to the Transportation Trust Fund, where it's going to be treated as slush money to support mass transit projects that don't work. Some of it is siloed out for motorists, but some of it isn't. And there was an amendment that was put on by Senate Republicans to hold that tire fee for motorists that the Senate adopted and the House demanded to have taken out. It's clear the direction that they're driving. That time the pun was intended. It's clear the direction they want to take the state of Maryland. It's a bad direction. It's an unsustainable direction. And I'll finish my answer by saying this, making really a broad statement about part of the reason why I'm running. I want my kids to be able to afford their first car, let alone their first house in this state. And that increasingly is becoming harder and harder to do. And Annapolis is just making it harder. And I don't think that's right. And this is one great example of how they are just making the cost of simply living your life, not going on vacations, not buying a boat, living your life in the state of Maryland near impossible to afford. And that's wrong.
We've seen a real change, haven't we, in the last couple of years, where Maryland was a state with immigration, and now we're seeing the population change. We're seeing a break down the growth, certainly domestic out migration, what have you. At a high level, how do we reverse those trends?
Well, at a high level, the answer is make Maryland affordable again. Make Maryland more affordable than it is. The data is clear. The Maryland Chamber of Commerce makes this crystal clear about why people are leaving the state of Maryland. And it's particularly, by the way, that exodus is being powered by retirees. Retirees are among the group that has the highest rate of emigration, particularly to states like Pennsylvania and Delaware, where it's a lot cheaper to retire, either because of, taxes on retirement or property values. And so there is no silver bullet to the question that you asked, but it comes from, this is sort of a good way to bring everything that I've said together. You've got to look at energy. You've got to look at taxes. You've got to look at retirement policy. You've got to look at the way we treat motorists. You've got to look at the way we treat homeowners. All of the things that we spent, and by the way, too, you've got to look at crime, because high crime makes, it can bring values of things down, but it also makes it really expensive to live somewhere when you don't know if your car is going to get broken into or not, and if your car is going to get stolen or not. So, we've just got to get serious about these things. And we've got to, I hate to put it this way, but we've got to bring Annapolis out of the la-la land in which it currently seems to live and bring it back down to, at about sea level, where most of us Marylanders live, few hundred feet above sea level out there in Western Maryland, and really roll up its sleeves and get working on these issues. Again, I point back to everything that I just spent saying for the past 40 minutes. It is all encompassing. In Maryland, it's death by 1,000 tax bills. We've heard of death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's death by 1,000 tax bills in the state of Maryland. There's no one answer that is going to bring people back. But there are many small answers, particularly as it relates to people's ability to afford to live here, and something we haven't talked about as much, but is equally as important, people's ability to find a good job here. And you've got to build a climate that businesses want to locate in the state of Maryland in doing. And if you don't do those things, the trend will not be reversed. And the state of Maryland will be in a significantly worse fiscal picture because we'll have an even smaller tax base to afford the runaway spending that Annapolis has saddled us with. And that's a very scary thought.
Well, and even though your lexicon is that of, probably a 60-year-old, I do want to remind the audience, Jake Taylor is 22 years old. Again, youngest elected official in Harford County history, and definitely making history in this race for delegate. So just in closing, do you have thoughts on, how your youth will make you a stellar delegate, running circles around the Democrats, or, anything to add specifically to your experience as a Gen Zer running for delegate?
It is such a privilege to get to do this at my age and to serve my community with the benefit of a long life ahead of me looking at it, and the benefit of knowing that everything I do to make my community better today is something that my children will be able to get to enjoy tomorrow. What I always tell people is that if they don't like my youth, I make a promise to them that very few politicians can say, and very few candidates for office can say. This is a promise that I cannot physically break. If you vote for me, I will get older. And so I will continue to age. But no, in all seriousness, I think the energy that I bring to the table, the perspective of a young person who is quite frankly scared about what the future of Maryland holds, is something that people need to hear from. They need to hear from the next generation. They need to hear what our concerns are, particularly as it relates to affordability, community safety, and fiscal responsibility. Because the reality is that if Maryland heads towards fiscal disaster, it will be our generation that is paying the tab. And that's morally wrong to do. It's morally wrong, but it's also just terrible policy for the community that we love. So I hope that the folks who've been listening at home have liked what they've heard. Contact me at votejake.taylor@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on all kinds of social media. I am really looking forward to representing my community as their delegate. And for anyone who listening who liked what they heard, I'd be honored to have your support in doing it.
Well, thank you. And I think now we're headed towards Masoni's, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds good to me.
Yes. Cue up the Masoni's.
Let's go down to Masoni's, where Italian cuisine shines. Let's go down to Masoni's, we'll have a good old time. Homemade pasta at Masoni's, sauce is fresh